At 6:47 a.m. on October 14th, 1944, a thin layer of fog drifted between the pines of the Hurtgen forest. The air was cold enough that every breath came out as a pale ghost of steam, and in the middle of that gray morning, tired, bruised, and covered in dirt, Private First Class Daniel Mercer stumbled forward with 6 German soldiers marching behind him, rifles locked on his back. His shirt was torn open, the buttons long gone, the fabric stiff with dried mud. He looked like a man who had been running for days. In a sense, he had. For the last 48 hours, his unit had been cut off during a chaotic night engagement, scattered across the forest in every direction. Mercer had tried to circle around to friendly lines. Instead, a German patrol found him first. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I want to thank you for choosing to watch my channel when there are so many other creators out there. Once again, I sincerely thank you, and I hope you can support me with a subscription and leave a comment with the number 1 after you finish listening to this story. Thank you very much. The Germans thought they had captured another exhausted American straggler, one more prisoner to be processed, questioned, and marched to the rear. Their formation was relaxed. 2 men on each flank, one behind him, one leading the group. They spoke casually in low voices, joking about how easy the morning sweep had been. Mercer kept his eyes down, pretending he didn't understand a word, but he understood every syllable. A cold breeze moved through the trees, pushing the fog aside long enough for Mercer to glance back. He caught the eyes of the youngest soldier behind him, a kid no older than 19, gripping his rifle too tight, the leather strap digging into his glove, nervous, uncertain, easy to rattle. The sergeant leading the patrol, however, was the opposite. Tall, rigid posture, immaculate uniform, the kind of man who lived by the rule book. He checked Mercer's pockets, canteen, and dog tags twice, then pushed him forward without emotion. Mercer let his knees buckle slightly, selling the illusion of weakness. Inside, his mind was sharp, calculating. He had counted every man in the squad, noted the spacing in their formation, observed the mud on their boots, meaning they had crossed a creek recently, which narrowed the direction they were heading. He recognized the unit patch on the sergeant's collar. He even caught the dialect in their voices. Rhineland, not Bavarian. Most important of all, none of them knew who he really was. To them, he was just another captured American rifleman. To the U.S. Army, he was something very different. The Germans pushed Mercer deeper into the forest, following a narrow trail that twisted between damp pines and broken branches left behind by days of artillery fire, while the cold morning light struggled to slip through the drifting fog overhead. The Hurtgen forest had earned its reputation as one of the most unforgiving battlegrounds in Europe, a place where visibility collapsed to mere yards, and entire platoons disappeared without leaving a single clear trace. His original mission had been simple enough: escort a communications technician to a forward relay point, but a night assault by German infantry forced their column to scatter, leaving small detachments isolated across the woods. The resulting confusion created pockets of lost soldiers, disrupted communication lines, and left units like Mercer's stranded miles away from friendly positions. The German patrol escorting him belonged to a regiment tasked with sweeping the forest after every major engagement, searching not only for retreating Americans but also for crucial documents, abandoned radio gear, or wounded soldiers who might still be carrying useful intelligence. Their confidence came from experience. They had captured dozens of Americans during the past month, using these same morning sweeps, and most prisoners were exhausted infantrymen who offered little resistance and even less information. Mercer walked in silence, letting them believe he fit neatly into that predictable category. Yet the forest itself told a different story. The churned soil beside the trail revealed that armored vehicles had passed recently, which meant the patrol was operating near a shifting front line where American and German forces collided nearly every day. Broken branches high on the trees suggested mortar airbursts during the previous night, while scattered shell fragments glittered faintly beneath the wet leaves. Every sign indicated that the Germans were stretched thin and cycling small patrols through terrain they no longer fully controlled, relying on routine rather than strength to maintain their presence. Mercer understood that this routine was his advantage. He recognized the patrol's cadence, the lead scout stepping first over routes, the sergeant checking the map every few minutes, and the rear guard adjusting his rifle strap whenever the trail narrowed. Their path curved steadily southeast, which meant they were moving toward a temporary German outpost rather than a fortified camp, giving Mercer fewer guards to deal with and far more opportunities to slip away before being processed. The Germans believed they were in control of the situation, but their overconfidence left gaps in their formation that Mercer quietly memorized. He also knew the Americans were not far. The sound of distant engines, faint but steady, suggested armored units repositioning on the ridgeline, while the rhythmic thud of sporadic gunfire hinted at another skirmish unfolding less than a mile away. If Mercer could decode the pattern correctly, and he usually could, he might still be moving parallel to friendly lines without the Germans realizing their own vulnerability. The patrol finally reached a small clearing where fallen trees created a natural choke point, prompting the sergeant to slow the formation and motion for caution, unaware that this very terrain gave Mercer a window to shift the balance. Shadows intertwined with the fog, muffling shape and movement, and the forest felt unnaturally quiet for a moment. Mercer raised his eyes slightly, calculating distances, counting breaths, and waiting for the single mistake that would change everything. Because the Germans believed they were escorting a worn-out prisoner. But Mercer knew he was walking toward a moment he had already begun to shape. As the patrol advanced beyond the clearing, Mercer felt the familiar weight of every rule drilled into American soldiers, knowing that the Army's official guidance for captured personnel relied on rigid simplicity that rarely survived the chaos of real combat. Training manuals insisted that a prisoner should speak only his name, rank, and serial number, trusting that discipline and silence would protect both the soldier and the broader mission from further compromise. However, those rules had been written for clean scenarios imagined in classrooms, not for tangled forests where patrols roamed unpredictably and where even the smallest hesitation could trigger deadly suspicion. The German sergeant leading the squad exemplified this harsh reality because his sharp instincts and rehearsed procedures were designed to detect prisoners who attempted deception, and he watched Mercer with a scrutiny that felt far more personal than the manual's cold instructions anticipated. Mercer understood that a single, misplaced gesture, an accent too controlled, or an expression held for a moment too long, might convince the sergeant that he was not a simple infantryman, turning a routine escort into a lethal interrogation. It was the kind of risk that the Army's doctrine never addressed, because no booklet could prepare a soldier for the psychological chess match unfolding in the damp stillness of the Hurtgen forest. As they continued along the narrowing trail, the sergeant ordered the patrol to halt so he could inspect Mercer's boots, a common tactic used to identify men who had traveled long distances or crossed restricted terrain, and Mercer allowed himself to sway slightly to maintain the illusion of exhaustion. The Germans, accustomed to encountering frightened or disoriented Americans, expected prisoners to comply without awareness or strategy, and this assumption formed the weak point in their rigid system. Mercer knew he needed to maintain the facade of confusion while quietly studying the sergeant's methods, recognizing that surviving the next few hours meant understanding the rules of the enemy as well as the flaws in his own training. The forest's oppressive silence made every small sound feel amplified, and when the sergeant questioned a private about the markings on Mercer's canteen, Mercer realized that even equipment could betray him if handled incorrectly. American manuals never mentioned how German patrols cross-referenced captured gear with known unit inventories to catch inconsistencies, and this lack of practical guidance forced Mercer to rely on quick thinking rather than regulation. He deliberately avoided eye contact, letting the sergeant interpret his posture as fear rather than calculation, because the manual's passive compliance strategy only worked when the captors followed predictable patterns, which the Germans in this forest clearly did not. Further down the trail, the patrol stopped again so the sergeant could verify Mercer's dog tags, holding them up to the thin morning light, as if searching for microscopic clues, and Mercer recognized that each pause tightened the psychological vice around him. The Army taught soldiers to endure questioning calmly, but those lessons ignored the reality that German patrols sometimes tested prisoners, with sudden commands or trick questions meant to provoke instinctive reactions. Mercer knew that the wrong reflex, turning too quickly, hesitating too long, or responding with unnecessary clarity, could mark him as someone far more trained or valuable than a simple rifleman. The deeper they moved into the forest, the more apparent it became that American doctrine had not prepared soldiers for a capture scenario where the terrain itself worked against them, because dense foliage reduced escape routes, muffled sound, and amplified the Germans' advantage in familiarity. The manual said nothing about adjusting one's breathing to match the pace of captors, nor about using environmental noise to mask subtle movements, skills Mercer had learned only through weeks of living in the forest, rather than through formal instruction. He recognized that survival depended on abandoning rigid rules when necessary, replacing them with adaptable instincts shaped by the chaotic reality of frontline operations. When the patrol paused at a split in the trail, The sergeant consulted a worn field map with a frown that revealed a rare moment of uncertainty, and Mercer seized the chance to analyze the patrol's internal dynamics. The manual emphasized endurance, silence, and resistance, but it never taught soldiers how to exploit the psychological tension inside enemy units, where fatigue, stress, and shifting loyalties widened cracks that someone observant could use. Mercer followed the sergeant's gestures closely, noting how the younger soldiers reacted to commands and how hesitation rippled through the formation, revealing that even a disciplined German patrol was held together by fragile human threads. As they resumed marching, the rules of capture that Mercer had memorized at basic training felt increasingly distant, replaced by a new understanding shaped by the forest's unpredictable rhythm and the patrol's mounting unease. The army had taught him how to endure captivity, but not how to turn the imbalance of power into an opportunity, and he sensed that the moment to challenge the situation was approaching faster than the Germans realized. He kept his breathing steady, his posture weakened, and his eyes half lowered, maintaining the illusion of helplessness while quietly preparing to break every rule he had ever been taught. Because the manual's world was theoretical, but the Hurtgen forest was real, and only one of them would decide whether he survived. As the patrol pressed deeper into the forest, Mercer felt the weight of memory rising with every step, because this wasn't the first time he had walked through a silence shaped by the aftermath of men who never made it home. Weeks earlier, during another morning sweep just like this one, his platoon had found the scattered remains of an American reconnaissance team lying beside a creek bed, their equipment half buried in mud and their positions frozen in the final moments of a fight they never had a chance to win. The sight had carved a permanent mark into Mercer's mind, reminding him that the Hurtgen forest consumed soldiers without distinction or mercy, turning every skirmish into a story only partially told by the few artifacts left behind. He remembered one of the men in particular, a radio operator named Collins, whose cracked headset still hung from a shattered tree trunk, as if waiting for someone to finish the message he never got to send. Collins had been thorough, disciplined, and cautious, yet even those qualities had not saved him from the sudden rush of German troops who swept through the ravine before dawn, leaving behind only a quiet echo of the chaos they unleashed. Mercer had crouched beside Collins's position for nearly a minute that morning, absorbing the reality that training, courage, and discipline often collapsed under the brutal unpredictability of forest warfare. The forest around them seemed almost indifferent, its towering trees swallowing the echoes of violence as quickly as they appeared, leaving only a faint smell of gunpowder trapped in the early morning mist. As Mercer walked now with the German patrol, those memories layered themselves over the thick fog drifting between the branches, reminding him that countless American soldiers had disappeared into this landscape without leaving even a clear account of their final minutes. The Germans escorting him carried themselves with an air of quiet certainty, unaware that many of their comrades had fallen in the same woods under equally sudden circumstances. Mercer realized that the forest didn't favor one side over the other. It simply magnified mistakes, punishing hesitation, overconfidence, or misjudgment with ruthless efficiency. In another part of the forest, only a week earlier, his unit had found footprints belonging to a squad of American engineers who vanished while attempting to reinforce a collapsed supply line. The trail showed signs of a brief struggle, followed by a chaotic scattering of boot impressions that suggested the men had tried to flee in different directions before being overwhelmed. The engineers were never found, and their disappearance served as a silent warning to every American unit operating in the Hurtgen. Once the forest swallowed men, it rarely returned them. Mercer carried that warning with him even now, feeling its cold grip tighten every time he glanced at the Germans walking only a few feet away. All these memories formed a heavy pressure against his chest, reminding him that the men who had vanished in these woods had been just as capable, determined, and resourceful as he was, yet circumstances and terrain had worked against them with devastating force. He knew that if he miscalculated even a single moment, if he hesitated when he needed to move, or moved when he needed to wait, he could easily join the long, unmarked list of those who never returned. The sobering truth was that survival here depended not on strength alone, but on timing, awareness, and a willingness to act before fear had time to take root. As the patrol passed another cluster of trees marked with faded shell impacts, Mercer glimpsed a torn scrap of American cloth snagged on a branch, fluttering weakly in the breeze like a quiet memorial to someone the forest had claimed. The sight hardened his resolve, because he understood that letting the Germans control the tempo of this march meant accepting the same fate as the men he had found scattered across these woods. He kept his breathing steady, and his expression dull, hiding the determination building behind his tired eyes. The forest had taken enough American lives already. Mercer refused to let his become another silent tally on its cold, indifferent ground. As the patrol descended toward a shallow ravine, lined with slick stones and dripping spruce branches, Mercer recognized that the Germans' confidence came from a structural flaw within their own system, a flaw that remained invisible to them, but painfully clear to anyone who had spent weeks navigating the forest's unpredictable dangers. Their search routines, interrogation habits, and formation patterns all relied on assumptions built from months of facing frightened American riflemen, rather than soldiers who understood how to manipulate the very framework the Germans trusted. Mercer knew these weaknesses existed, yet breaking through them required patience, timing, and an understanding of how rigid doctrine often blinded an army to subtle shifts unfolding right in front of them. He remembered the concealed runoff ditch hidden beneath a bed of pine needles just ahead, a narrow depression that could swallow a man's legs and disrupt even a disciplined patrol if they weren't watching their footing. The presence of that ditch, combined with the patrol's growing uncertainty, provided the smallest hint of an opening one that required perfect timing to exploit. Yet Mercer's true advantage lay not only in his knowledge of the forest or his command of the German language, but in the way he understood human behavior under stress. He sensed the creeping anxiety behind the sergeant's forced authority, the irritation brewing in the corporal's voice, and the fraying concentration of the youngest soldier whose eyes darted toward every sound that rose from the trees. These observations were not guesses. They were the practiced evaluations of a man who had spent months troubleshooting complex field systems under battlefield pressure, learning to read failure patterns long before they became catastrophic. As the patrol slowed near the familiar ridge, Mercer allowed his breathing to deepen just enough to suggest fatigue, while maintaining the controlled rhythm necessary for sudden movement. He noted the distance between himself and the nearest guard, calculated the angle at which the sergeant scanned the tree line, and measured the staggered spacing that had emerged as the patrol's confidence eroded. Every detail mattered, because the next step of his plan could not rely on luck. It had to rely on controlled disruption, precise timing, and the latent skills the patrol had no reason to suspect he possessed. The moment crystallized as the sergeant raised his hand for yet another halt, turning his head away from Mercer to address the men behind him, unaware that this simple gesture exposed a subtle but critical weakness in their formation. Mercer felt a calm certainty settle over him, a clarity born from the realization that all the elements he needed, terrain, information, timing, and emotional fractures, had finally aligned in his favor. The Germans still believed they were escorting a helpless prisoner through the forest. What they didn't know was that they had just handed him the exact moment he had been waiting for. As the sergeant lowered his hand and signaled the patrol to resume movement, Mercer shifted his gaze just enough to study each German soldier without breaking the illusion of exhaustion that had kept their suspicions low. He knew that moments of transition during a march often revealed the most valuable information, because soldiers tended to expose their natural habits when they believed they were simply adjusting formation rather than actively engaging a threat. This subtle window allowed Mercer to observe their posture, spacing, and focus with the practiced attention of someone trained to troubleshoot complex systems by recognizing the smallest irregularities. The youngest soldier, still walking off to Mercer's rear left, revealed his fear through the way he constantly adjusted the strap of his rifle, tightening and loosening it with a rhythm that betrayed an anxious compulsion rather than a functional need. Mercer recognized that behavior instantly, because nervous men tended to fixate on equipment when they lacked confidence in their surroundings, creating blind spots that could widen at critical moments. If Mercer made any move toward escape, this particular soldier would likely react slowly or with hesitation, providing a predictable gap in the patrol's response that he could exploit when the time came. The corporal on Mercer's right displayed a different set of vulnerabilities, because his movements were sharp but impatient, suggesting a man growing increasingly frustrated with the sergeant's constant halts and rechecks. Every few minutes, the corporal muttered something under his breath, complaints about route changes, wasted time, and dwindling daylight, and Mercer understood that resentment, within a formation, could be just as dangerous as fear, because it weakened cohesion and made soldiers less likely to coordinate effectively when surprised. The corporal's irritation created a second axis of instability inside the patrol, one that Mercer quietly marked as another potential opening. The sergeant, however, remained the most important piece of the puzzle, because his rigid posture masked a tension that Mercer recognized from countless officers who tried to maintain authority despite growing uncertainty. The sergeant's glances at the foggy tree line had grown longer, and his steps carried a subtle hesitation that hadn't been present earlier, revealing his suspicion that the patrol's route no longer matched the terrain he expected. Mercer knew that once doubt crept into a leader's mind, decision-making became slower and more cautious, creating delays that could be manipulated by anyone with a clearer understanding of the environment. As they approached a cluster of boulders partially hidden by moss and low branches, Mercer observed the rear guard fall slightly out of sync with the others, his focus drifting as he scanned the forest with an expression that suggested he was listening for something he couldn't quite identify. The terrain itself offered important clues, and Mercer used his peripheral vision to map the subtle angles of the ground, noting the slope of the ridge, the scattered rocks beneath layers of needles, and the narrow runoff path he remembered from his previous reconnaissance mission. By mentally overlaying his memories onto the landscape unfolding around him, he built an internal map far more accurate than anything the sergeant held in his gloved hands. Soldiers who trusted their surroundings moved with steady rhythms, but this patrol had begun to falter, their footfalls growing irregular as anxiety and impatience pulled their attention in conflicting directions. The forest amplified these signals, transforming small shifts in movement into clear indicators of who felt confident and who felt vulnerable, giving Mercer a detailed portrait of the patrol's emotional and tactical state. Every observation aligned into a coherent picture that sharpened with each passing minute, and Mercer realized he now possessed a deeper understanding of the patrol than they had of themselves. He knew which soldier would freeze, which would panic, which would obey instinctively, and which would hesitate long enough to create an opening. Instead, he felt like an analyst quietly guiding the situation toward a point of leverage, constructing a strategy from the very behaviors his captors revealed without realizing it. The patrol believed they were watching him, yet they never noticed how completely he had been watching them. And with every carefully hidden glance, Mercer felt himself drawing closer to the moment when observation would finally become action. As the patrol emerged from the shallow depression and began climbing a narrow incline covered in wet pine needles, Mercer sensed the moment tightening around him like a coiled spring, waiting for the slightest trigger to release its stored force. For hours he had obeyed the role of the weary prisoner, maintaining the fragile illusion that he was just another exhausted American dragged through hostile terrain. Yet beneath that mask, the plan forming in his mind had grown sharper and more deliberate. He knew that to survive, he would soon have to break every rule the Army had ever taught him, because the manual's guidance offered no real protection in a forest where uncertainty ruled every step. The sergeant, still walking several paces ahead, paused near the crest of the hill to check the map once more, revealing the same hesitant tension that had been growing inside him since the patrol entered unfamiliar ground. Mercer recognized that hesitation instantly, because leaders often faltered when forced to reconcile doctrine with an environment that refused to cooperate, and this disconnect made them vulnerable to manipulation. The sergeant's frustration with the terrain created an opportunity for Mercer to test boundaries the Germans assumed were fixed, pressing gently against their expectations, without drawing the suspicion that could end his life in seconds. When the patrol resumed movement toward a section of trail flanked by thick underbrush, Mercer let himself stumble deliberately, allowing his knee to hit the ground with enough force to draw a sharp command from the corporal. Instead of responding with fear, he muttered a quiet phrase in flawless German, just a brief apology, delivered with the weary cadence of someone too tired to choose his words carefully. The patrol froze. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath as the corporal stared at Mercer with a mixture of surprise and confusion, unable to reconcile the prisoner's unannounced shift from silence to the language of his captors. Mercer quickly lowered his head, pretending he hadn't realized what he said, allowing the appearance of fatigue to disguise the calculated violation of his training. Speaking to the enemy was forbidden under every rule he had memorized, yet silence offered no advantage now, and the shock on the Germans' faces confirmed that breaking doctrine had delivered the exact effect he intended. The sergeant approached him slowly, his suspicion sharpening, as he demanded to know whether Mercer understood their language, but Mercer merely shook his head and muttered a faint English curse, playing the part of a man confused by pain rather than by linguistic choice. The sergeant's doubt lingered, however, and Mercer saw it flicker across his expression like a shadow passing beneath heavy clouds. That doubt disrupted the steady rhythm of the patrol, forcing the Germans to question whether their prisoner was weaker or more aware than they previously believed. This hesitation served Mercer perfectly, because uncertainty often bred mistakes small enough to overlook but large enough to open cracks in even the tightest formation. He used the moment of distraction not to escape, but to subtly shift his position within the patrol, placing himself between the nervous young soldier and the inattentive rear guard, creating the kind of spacing that could be exploited later. A few minutes later, the sergeant ordered another halt so he could reevaluate the map, clearly unsettled by the earlier exchange and the increasing thickness of the fog, which muffled sound and narrowed visibility to mere yards. The fog thickened as they descended toward a lower section of the ridge, and the limited visibility amplified the patrol's anxiety, because each man now struggled to distinguish harmless rustles from genuine threats concealed within the muted forest. Mercer listened closely to their tense breathing and uneven footfalls, hearing the slight distortions that signaled the men were no longer moving as a unified body, but as individuals burdened by their own isolated fears. Mercer felt the atmosphere shift again, noticing how the tension between the soldiers now hung as thick as the fog surrounding them, pressing into every movement and every breath. He understood that these compounded stresses, though subtle in isolation, had begun to reshape the patrol's psychological terrain in ways that could no longer be easily corrected. Mercer knew the terrain intimately, remembering how he once crossed this same slope during a nighttime reconnaissance mission, and he understood exactly how to use its treacherous contours to fracture the patrol's already weakened cohesion. The sergeant ordered the men to spread out slightly, but his voice lacked the steady authority he relied on earlier, and the corporal reacted with visible irritation rather than disciplined obedience. As they reached the midpoint of the slope, Mercer purposely stepped onto a patch of loose needles he knew would slide beneath his weight, pitching him forward just enough to force the corporal beside him to react instinctively. The corporal grabbed Mercer's arm to steady him, but in doing so he momentarily turned his body away from the young soldier behind him, blocking the already narrow path and triggering a chain reaction of missteps. The young soldier stumbled against the rear guard, whose boot slipped on the wet moss, sending him lurching sideways into the trunk of a low-leaning spruce. The sergeant spun at the sudden commotion, barking a command that only heightened the chaos as the corporal snapped back with a defensive explanation, and the patrol's attention fractured in 3 different directions at once. In that split second of disarray, Mercer lowered his center of gravity and pivoted toward the runoff ditch he remembered from weeks earlier, allowing the natural slope to hide his movement as he dropped to one knee. The ditch, barely a foot deep but perfectly positioned, provided a narrow visual blind spot that shielded him from the sergeant's immediate line of sight. With the patrol momentarily distracted by their own imbalance, Mercer reached down and pulled the corporal's fallen canteen strap across the narrow trail, dragging it just enough to create an obstruction no one noticed until the corporal tried to step forward. His boot caught the strap, throwing him off balance and forcing him to stumble violently into the young soldier, who reacted by flinching backward and raising his rifle in panic. The rear guard, startled by the sudden movement, slipped again and crashed onto the damp ground, cursing as the sergeant shouted for everyone to hold their positions. Mercer used the rising confusion to slip further into the ditch, pressing himself against the cold earth while the fog wrapped around him like a second cloak. The Germans were only feet away, yet their attention was consumed entirely by the cascading disorder Mercer had engineered, each man responding not to him but to the unexpected chaos erupting inside their formation. He moved with controlled precision, crawling along the narrow depression toward a clump of brush that concealed a natural break in the ridge, a passage he had memorized during earlier reconnaissance. As he reached the cover of the brush, Mercer heard the sergeant's voice crack under pressure, demanding to know where the prisoner had gone, and the sudden edge of panic in his tone told Mercer everything he needed to know about the patrol's unraveling. The young soldier insisted that Mercer had been right beside the corporal only moments earlier, while the rear guard blamed the fog for obscuring his view, and the corporal argued that the sergeant's constant halts had led to this confusion. Their voices collided in a tangle of frustration, fear, and disbelief, forming the perfect cover for Mercer as he slipped between the brush and disappeared into the thicker forest. He moved quickly but silently, using the slope's natural curves to mask his retreat, each step calculated to minimize noise and maximize distance before the patrol regained its senses. The forest swallowed him effortlessly, offering the concealment that had eluded him all morning, and the fog thickened behind him as if sealing off the path he had taken. For the first time since his capture, Mercer felt the weight on his chest ease, not because he was safe, but because control had finally shifted fully into his hands. Behind him, the Germans shouted his name, as if he were obligated to answer. Ahead of him, the forest opened like a doorway he had been preparing to walk through all along. As Mercer pushed deeper into the fog-soaked forest, he forced his breathing into a controlled rhythm that allowed him to move quickly without alerting the disoriented Germans scrambling somewhere behind him, their shouts dissolving into fractured echoes swallowed by the trees. He knew the patrol would attempt to regroup and hunt him through the ravine. Yet he also understood that their search would lack the cohesion necessary for an effective pursuit, because the psychological collapse he had engineered would take far longer to repair than the sergeant could possibly anticipate. Every passing second widened the gap between Mercer and his former captors, turning the chaotic slope into a natural barrier the Germans were reluctant to descend again. The forest's dense terrain offered Mercer both concealment and direction, because he recognized the pattern of broken branches and scattered shell fragments that indicated recent American activity in the area, guiding him subtly toward the ridgeline where friendly units might still be repositioning. Although exhaustion tugged heavily at his legs, he pushed forward with the clarity of someone who knew his escape meant more than personal survival. It meant carrying information the Army desperately needed about German patrol routes, manpower, and weaknesses he had observed while walking among them. His time as a prisoner had provided him with a map far more valuable than anything captured on paper, one drawn from behavior, formation habits, and subtle tactical routines the Germans likely considered invisible. As he moved through a shallow gully, lined with fallen branches, Mercer paused long enough to scan the tree line behind him, noting how the fog muted sound and distorted distance in ways that would hinder the patrol's ability to track him. He heard nothing but the soft drip of condensation falling from the pines, confirming that the Germans were still disorganized and arguing among themselves, too preoccupied with blame and confusion to coordinate a proper chase. Mercer recognized that their delayed response would buy him precious time to reach the outer edges of the forest, where scattered American positions might still maintain loose control over a network of listening posts and forward observers. Crossing a section of uneven terrain, he remembered the intelligence briefing his unit received weeks earlier, which warned that German patrols in the Hurtgen often relied on predictable sweep patterns that left narrow windows between their routes, windows small enough for an experienced reconnaissance soldier to exploit if he understood rhythm. Mercer smiled faintly despite the fatigue, realizing that his escape had fallen directly into one of those windows, allowing him to slip between the seams of German control with a precision no manual could ever teach. If he could reach the old logging road ahead, he knew he would be within a few hundred yards of a secondary American relay point abandoned earlier in the campaign but potentially still visited by signal runners and map teams. As he continued, a distant rumble echoed from the north, the low, steady growl of armored engines repositioning along the ridgeline, and Mercer immediately recognized the cadence as American Shermans rather than German Panzer IVs. That familiar resonance lifted a weight from his chest, because armored movement often meant the presence of infantry units nearby, and any friendly unit, no matter how small, could relay his information back to division headquarters. He angled toward the sound, forcing his tired legs to maintain a steady pace, while the forest slope pressed heavily against his calves. Near the crest of the ridge, Mercer spotted a faint indentation in the ground, a barely visible footpath lined with broken twigs, cigarette ash, and a strip of canvas likely torn from an American haversack. These details confirmed what he had hoped. Americans had passed through recently, and their trail led toward a low cluster of firs acting as a natural choke point. With renewed urgency, he followed the path until the trees opened into a shallow saddle where two American scouts emerged with rifles raised, their expressions shifting from alarm to disbelief as Mercer raised his hands and spoke his name in a hoarse but steady voice. Within minutes, he was escorted toward a temporary command post tucked behind a fallen log barricade, where an officer listened carefully as Mercer detailed the Germans' route, the patrol's composition, and the psychological fractures he had observed among the enemy. The officer's expression hardened with interest as Mercer described the sergeant's reliance on rigid doctrine, the young soldier's fear, and the corporal's simmering frustration, recognizing these insights as the kind of field-level intelligence that could reshape how American units navigated the forest's deadly patrol corridors. Mercer had not only escaped, he had returned with knowledge capable of saving dozens, perhaps hundreds of men who might otherwise fall into the same traps. The burden that had weighed on Mercer since his capture finally eased as he finished his report, knowing that everything he endured in those tense hours would now serve a purpose far greater than mere survival. The forest still loomed with its cold indifference, but for the first time since his capture, Mercer felt its oppressive weight begin to lift. He had escaped the Germans' grasp and brought back the one thing they never intended him to carry, an advantage his entire division could use. In the days that followed Mercer's return, the intelligence he delivered rippled through the regimental command structure with a quiet urgency, prompting officers and reconnaissance teams to reevaluate how German patrols operated within the tangled terrain of the Hurtgen Forest. His descriptions of their formation patterns, discipline fractures, and psychological vulnerabilities allowed American units to adjust their own movement strategies, using the enemy's rigid routines against them in ways the Germans never anticipated. For the first time in weeks, small American detachments began slipping through previously dangerous corridors with confidence, avoiding ambushes that had once seemed inevitable and striking isolated German teams before they could regroup. As field reports accumulated, commanders noted a measurable decline in American casualties along the forest's most volatile patrol routes, validating Mercer's belief that survival often depended less on firepower and more on understanding how people behaved under mounting stress. His insights reshaped briefings across multiple battalions, reinforcing the idea that the Hurtgen's greatest danger wasn't merely the mines, the machine guns, or the hidden artillery, but the way the forest magnified human error until it became catastrophic. Mercer's experience demonstrated that recognizing the subtle human patterns beneath enemy doctrine could turn an oppressive battlefield into something navigable, even if only by inches at a time. Word of his escape spread slowly, carried in passing remarks among engineers, scouts, and signal crews who operated in the same suffocating terrain, and many of them began adopting techniques inspired by his observations. Some learned to read the emotional cues of opposing patrols, while others gained confidence in trusting their instincts when doctrine failed to account for the forest's shifting conditions. Mercer never sought recognition for what he had done, yet his influence threaded itself into the decisions of men who would never know his name, guiding them through the same choking fog and uneven ridges he had traversed alone. Despite the quiet admiration surrounding his return, Mercer himself remained unchanged, maintaining the steady humility of someone who viewed his survival not as an act of heroism, but as the product of timing, observation, and a stubborn refusal to accept the fate the forest had intended for him. When officers praised his composure and initiative, he responded with the same simple expression that he had done only what the circumstances demanded, nothing more. Those who encountered him afterward often remarked on his calm presence, as if he carried with him an understanding of the forest few others possessed, a knowledge earned not through training but through the raw intimacy of being hunted. In the months that followed, as the front line pushed eastward and the Hurtgen gradually loosened its grip on the soldiers who fought within it, Mercer returned occasionally to the edges of the forest during supply runs or reconnaissance assignments. Each time he looked upon the towering pines and the heavy shadows between them, he felt the weight of those who had not escaped, the men whose stories ended beneath that indifferent canopy without witness or record. It reminded him that survival carried its own form of responsibility, a quiet burden to ensure that the lessons learned in those haunted woods were not lost to the relentless churn of the campaign. The forest, indifferent as ever, kept its secrets buried beneath layers of needles and mist, but Mercer's experience carved a small crack in its silence, an enduring reminder that even in the most unforgiving environments, human insight could alter the shape of events in ways no weapon alone ever could. His escape was not celebrated with medals or reports read in command tents. It lived instead in the subtle shifts of strategy, in the cautious steps of patrol leaders, and in the sharpened instincts of soldiers who learned to trust more than the rigid lines of their manuals. In the end, Mercer's legacy was not defined by the daring moment he slipped through the German patrol, but by the quieter truth that emerged from his journey. That survival in war often belonged to those who could see beyond rules, beyond fear, and beyond the rigid expectations of doctrine. It was the legacy of a man who recognized that even in the darkest corners of the conflict, the mind remained the sharpest tool a soldier could carry. And long after the fog of the Hurtgen had lifted, his story lived on not as a tale of luck or desperation, but as a testament to the power of perception, resilience, and the quiet ingenuity that allowed one man to escape the forest that had claimed so many others.